Wang Shangjai says that when you do the posture moving backwards, everything is the same apart from the left foot moves back. And he's very specific about what this posture's for. He talks about someone trying to kick you in the crotch. And he also says or emphasises that this technique is for hitting someone in the face. And we'll look at this another time, but that's because this posture isn't all that useful for example, hitting someone's guard at a distance. It's much more useful at a closer range, hence closer range target like hitting them right in the face. And if you look carefully at the little articulation of the hand, you can see exactly what he means by it being a potential like scratch into the face of the opponent, and that being not necessarily a terrible technique. But let's think about the setting of the posture, because Wang Shangjai says other than the stepping, everything else is the same. So as we step back, the lead foot becomes the rear foot, and that means that we're doing something similar to a cross. It's a rear hand technique no matter how the posture started. And you can see that it lands on the ball of the foot, so it's like a pivot root. So if you were doing a cross, you would use a pivot root to twist up into the posture, but stepping back you still do the same posture. And this begins to tell you that things like pivot roots are not just arbitrary decisions from a cultural set. They've got very logical reasons in terms of the mechanics of the movement. And just like a cross, the lead foot is flat on the floor. And we don't want to get bogged down with theory. The theory's there to help us, but you can feel when you do the posture that it's quite an orthodox set. So really the dominant set is the front foot, just like it would be with a cross, because you can feel the energy of the movement push down into the floor with that lead foot heel. And what was the lead foot kicks back, becomes the rear foot, and the ball of the foot hits the ground quite hard. But remember, we introduced the idea of a compression set, and all postures set like this with a little bit of compression, i.e. the rear foot pushing forwards helps also to push down onto the front foot and into the heel, so that helps to solidify it with a little bit of compression. And all in all, that makes it a very orthodox set, because it's a rear hand posture with a lead foot dominant set, which is the orthodox way of doing it in most Yiquan postures that are this big. And also remember this idea that when we reverse postures, so instead of doing a lead hand posture, we do a rear hand posture, how everything very often just reverses with it. Again, the theory can be helpful or not helpful. The important thing is that you feel all this stuff intuitively through training, and that's how I learned. And then you start adding the theory on afterwards, you start understanding what's happening scientifically. But the idea is that it's the science of each one, so understanding it theoretically and physically is the ideal goal. I mean, it's more important to understand it physically, obviously, but if we want to progress, problem solve, expand deeper into the infinite curriculum, that's when you need to understand the theory. Okay, so let's take another look at the structure that this posture forms, and if I do say so myself, this is like a perfect example of what we mean by a triangular structure that's captured within a rounded physical movement concept. In other words, if you take Wang Shangjai's principle of triangular structures and then you feed that into Wang Shangjai's principle of Hun Yuan Li, and you've got to create some kind of doctrine of the mean with it, this is the posture that you will come up with in this situation. It's like the mean average of a combination of roundedness and triangular structure. This is the posture that you come up with. It maximises stability in the context of speed, releasing force. It's adaptive, it's springy, it's triangular, it's rounded, and it's also curtailed, so it's not too big. It's just the absolute perfect doctrine of the mean between all of our quintessence principles. Well, maybe perfect is going a bit too far. So anyway, let's move on and think about the timing of the set in this case. So as the ball of the foot, what becomes the rear leg, hits the floor, that's the point where you form the lock point. So it's no longer a distributed harmony, it's much closer to being a Xing Yiquan kind of harmony where the foot hits the floor at exactly the same time as the hip. But remember, the dominant set is on the front foot. So it actually won't matter when we form the lock point in the overall timing of the movement, because it will always be in time with just pushing down into the floor, because the foot is already there, the lead heel is already there. So that's always going to be a perfect harmony as long as we get the body movement correct. What matters here in terms of the timing most of all is what the rear foot does, what was the lead foot that becomes the rear foot. In this example, that's going to hit the ground at exactly the same time as we form the lock point into the strike. I mean, you don't have to. You could do the step and then do the posture. For example, you could do the step, cover your head, and then do the posture. That's what we call a split harmony, and it's one of the techniques that we have to learn once you've escaped from the ideology of the cultural set of Yiquan. So you don't have to do it at the same time. But for this exercise, we're not doing that. We're trying to understand about the timing of this particular posture, in which case we want to time it so that as the kickback routine goes back into the ground at exactly the same time, we form the lock point and everything compresses down onto the dominant set on the lead foot. And that's what transmits the force, the kinetic force that we generate to the hit point. Okay, from there let's change into a different kind of stepping back. This time just shifting back with the rear foot and then the lead foot follows. And recall that when we did this moving forwards, this is called a leading step. Well, it's still called a leading step when we move backwards, only it's called a retreating leading step. And the setting for this posture will be completely orthodox, even though it's going in reverse. So it's a lead hand technique with a rear foot set. And it's going to be a perfect harmony because the lock point is going to happen at exactly the moment the rear heel hits the floor. And remember, you're landing on the ball of the foot, and at that point you're just moving into the strike, and then as you hit the hit point, the heel just slams back into the floor. And you can clearly see here the idea that Wang Xingjia is getting across, that whenever you use a set, you're using sync. So whenever you use even rise, when you set the posture, that's using an element of sync. That's always contained within it. And you can also see here how you use your body weight to create that kind of compression set on the back foot, how it locks it in. And from there, it's just a matter of working on your timing, getting every part of the posture, but that's just practice. Eventually, it just comes second nature. Okay, from there, let's change to stepping forward with rear hand sweeping of the bell. And also, let's escalate the rate of our progression by thinking about what we've called the A version and the B version. So thinking about the same posture, but with two different contexts. So look at this. It's the same posture, i.e. it's rear hand sweeping the bell, but I'm changing the context that I'm using each time. So the first one here I'm using close, and there I'm using open. Close, open. And the most common reason for that, as we've discussed, is when you are deciding between gap Farley or brace Farley, i.e. you're hitting with Farley with a gap, or your hands are on the opponent and you need to brace and articulate the movement into your own structure and then push. But the second reason we do this is for deciding on the entries when we're using kind of breaking hands or guard engage techniques. So for moving either side out of the way of a posture that's incoming or an opponent's guard, and then following that up with a strike. And to explore some of the interesting things that this does around setting, let's go back to the start, because it started with the step and the Xingyichuan style, Pichuan. And we explained that Wang Xingjia explains this posture with a step, but we haven't looked at it on the spot yet, and that's where we've got to start and then expand from there to some of the really interesting things you can do with setting when you change between the A and the B setting.